I welcome May and Sean from Made in India to our Afro-Asia Imaging Summit 2021. Welcome. Let me introduce May Merriam Thomas to you. May Merriam Thomas is a presenter, journalist, podcast producer, and audio content consultant with over 15 years of work experience in radio and podcasting. She is currently the founder of the podcast production company and consultancy Made in India. Sean started his career practicing law in Mumbai with the law firm Mullah and Mullah, and post this stint, he was stationed in the border between Nagaland and Burma for 8 years, where he worked on the electrification of 126 villages in Nagaland. Simultaneously, he helped in the execution and recreational space young people in Mizoram called Falkland. Currently, Sean runs Made in India as a legal counsel, financial advisor, head of production, and everything in between. Can you tell us a little bit about the work that you have done in the social sector?
I'm Sean Phantom and I handle operations at Made in India. We are an indie podcast production company and we help you make your podcast. So whether you're a brand, a creator, an NGO, someone who's in the social sector, foundations, we help you get your voice out there to the world. So May and I actually stumbled on to the social sector and doing a couple of podcasts over there. It started off with She Says She's Fine, which was a women's health podcast that we did with a gynecologist by the name of Dr. Munjal Kapadia. It was a really interesting show in the concept stage when we were working on it, because initially the idea was that Dr. Munjal would interview his patients or other guests and debunk myths and talk about women's health. Because even at the time when we started the show, there wasn't a lot of conversation around women's health in the Indian media space. But my partner May, who you just met, had the interesting insight to actually have two women speaking to Dr. Munjal, because it formed a support network within the podcast universe itself. And additionally, it helped explain a really interesting concept that even though you may be going through a problem which is named something that's a common name like a PCOS, your personal experience of the problem might be very different. And it allowed us the opportunity to have really varied conversations around women and women's health. So we've done some pretty interesting podcasts in the social sector. One of the shows I'm most proud about is a show we've done with a publication called India Development Review called On the Contrary. On the Contrary is a podcast where we try and have two individuals who come from differing perspectives on climate, on gender studies, on women empowerment or the rights of minorities, to sit down and discuss things that are really important to India's future. Because even though you come from a different thought space, through a conversation, we feel that you can find common ground. And that's been the backbone of that podcast. And I think it's one of the most fascinating discussions. Of every week I listen to fascinating discussions on that podcast. Another podcast that is really, really dear to me is a podcast we started, I think, in the second half of this year with an NGO called Catalyst for Social Action. They're an NGO that looks into the rights of vulnerable children in India, those who've been abandoned or those who don't come from particularly safe family homes. The podcast is called Care of the State, because children who are abandoned are technically in charge, their protection is taken care by the government. And what are the institutions and organizations that protect them and take care of their daily needs? It's a topic that I think most people can empathize with, but not many people can understand the nuance and the complexities in the system that exists and where are the pain points. So it's a show that just tries to help our listeners understand what is the current state of children in India and how can we look to protecting them better and giving them better facilities. One of the tragedies of the recently past pandemic and the thing that we still find ourselves in is that close to 120,000 children lost their parents during India's COVID crisis. And it's a topic that I think needs more conversation. And through podcasting, which is the medium of conversation, we'll be able to at least try and bring some attention to it through the thing I'm most passionate about. May, do you have something you'd like to share?
Hi, I'm May Mariam Thomas, and I run a podcast production company and consultancy called Made in India. So a couple of the shows that we've worked on around social issues actually started out with She Says She's Fine that we did with a gynecologist here in India called Dr. Munjal Kapadia. That show started out really interestingly. Initially, Dr. Munjal would do a lot of these like Ask Me Anything, these AMAs online on Twitter and Instagram. And one of the things that he realized was that there was just so much information that women didn't know around their sort of sexual and, menstrual health. And that's where She Says She's Fine was born. We want her to be able to talk to women about their personal experiences with regards to their reproductive health. And I think what was important was that we wanted to have like a variety of women who were open about talking about aspects of, sex and contraception and periods and PCOS and endometriosis and motherhood. And I think the most exciting part of what we were doing with She Says She's Fine was being able to have women talk very openly about what they've been going through. The grand debate of the pad versus tampon versus menstrual cup, or as mothers, what it is to be, a working mom as well as having to raise a child, and what is the role of fathers and fatherhood. And I think we really enjoyed doing the show because we were able to highlight the nuances of this experience through these conversations and through these stories. Another podcast that I'm really excited about, it's not been released yet. Another show that's really close to my heart is one that we've been working with a publication from Dubai called Reset. And they basically are an online platform that covers subjects around gender and disability and parenting and mental health. And the founder, Akanksha Tangri, is someone who wanted to be able to have conversations and bring up topics that are rarely discussed in the mainstream. So some of the episodes and the topics that we've covered is around trolling and social media, around what it's like to be Black in India, about disability in dating, or how has COVID-19 caused a mental health crisis in India. So these subjects are literally not being covered in the mainstream well enough. And it was a really great opportunity for us to be able to cover topics like this that you wouldn't usually hear or listen to or watch. So I think Why This Now by Reset is also a podcast that I'm super excited about.
How is a podcast an effective tool for communication?
So podcasting is an effective tool for communication because it's a really great medium to be able to inform people, to have more nuanced conversations and cover topics that you usually wouldn't talk about in mainstream media. It also, being an audio medium, you don't actually need active screen time. So you're able to do other tasks while you listen to a podcast, which is why, for example, people are able to listen for longer. So whether you're making your cup of coffee in the morning, or you're in the shower, or you're on your commute, whatever that it is that you're doing, what they say is that audio is a companion activity. So listening to a podcast is a companion activity. You get a chance to listen while you're doing other tasks, which is why people are able to consume the medium for longer.
What are some of the challenges, Sean, you faced while podcasting?
Since the pandemic, the primary challenge for podcasters and podcasting has been recording audio at a quality level. Ear fatigue is a thing. Most listeners get tired of badly recorded shows. So no matter how interesting your conversation or how fascinating your guest is, if the audio quality is not good, people are not going to listen. So what they were forgiving for at the start of the pandemic is not the case today. So training our sound engineers and our teams to what was the best solutions available for recording podcasts, to talking to our guests and our hosts of how to record your podcast, your introductions, as well as keep a conversation going, which is through a video conferencing app or through an audio first recording app. There are many, many challenges. So those ideas and how we overcame those pain points was perhaps, at least for the last 2 years, has been something that has been an interesting journey for sure. A longer term challenge about podcasting has been explaining the medium. Most people who come into this space compare it to YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and try and have an expectation of a podcast with platforms which is not the same. You're not comparing apples to apples in this particular situation. Podcasting is new digital real estate. It's also democratized audio, which is that you're not locked to a platform. I can compare videos on just YouTube numbers or Vimeo or any of those other platforms that are there. In podcasting, your audio is available on almost all audio streaming apps, be it Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music. You're available everywhere. So though you're available everywhere, the metrics that you're actually measuring on is that you are actually trying to promote your show everywhere. The second thing that's important in podcasting to understand is that you may not have the quantifiable numbers of YouTube, but you have a far higher retention number. And explaining to creators that the quality of their show should not be measured by the metric of an Instagram like has been a real challenge at the start of podcasting. And I do foresee it being a challenge for a few more years. But once people are more comfortable with the medium, they'll understand and not be disappointed when they don't have 1 million downloads in the first week. That's not how you hack podcasting.
Can you share some insights to some of the shows you have worked on?
So one of the things that I think is interesting about some of the shows that we've worked on is that I sometimes feel like we're in a space where we're constantly playing a numbers game. It's like how many people are listening and how many people are watching. So this idea of we have to get the maximum number of people to be able to consume media. But no one is necessarily looking at it from a quality perspective, which is that what is the impact the content that I'm putting out there have on people? And I think we have seen that in podcasting, because it's a growing medium in India right now, and it's sort of experienced exponential growth globally, it's fascinating to kind of understand that with podcasting in particular, the more specific your content is, the more specific your subject matter is, the more effective it actually becomes, because you're building a community around what it is that you're talking about. And specificity is actually a really good idea. So one aspect of that we have kind of realized as we've been kind of chugging along and making podcasts with different people is that quality is really important. And quality not in terms of just how we produce a show, but also the audience and how they're interacting with what we're putting out there in the show. So, for example, when we did our women's health podcast, She Says She's Fine, one really interesting story that I can't forget is that our host, Dr. Munjal Kapadia, got a message from a guy who ran a car dealership. And he said that when he heard the episode around contraception and sex, he said that he was able to have a conversation with his 12-year-old daughter about sex and consent and contraception without actually having to have it with her. He realized that it was uncomfortable and awkward, but he knew he had to have that conversation. But he basically used the podcast as a way to get his daughter to understand basically a little bit of sex education. And so for him, by getting her to listen to the episode, he was able to alleviate, the awkwardness of that conversation by actually giving her a show to listen to that had women talking about it and talking clearly and openly about something that is sometimes an uncomfortable conversation. So I think just knowing that impact brings so much value to what you're doing, that it isn't just about playing the numbers game, that sometimes it's also about how people are using your conversations on your show to create more conversations in the world, in your community, in society, among friends, among family, and so on. Another insight I'd like to share with you from just the work that we've been doing in podcasting is that we've realized that, a rambly conversation doth a podcast not make. So just doing an interview show or just having a sort of conversation isn't just the only way in which you can create a podcast. There's so many different kinds of formats, different ways of telling stories, different ways of communicating information to people or entertaining people or putting a message out there. So I definitely think that not enough has been explored in terms of different kinds of formats. I also think that there are so many stories to be told. There's so many people whose voices haven't been heard. There's so many uniqueness in terms of people's experiences and people's perspectives and people's, insights that haven't actually come across in mainstream media, which is why I think podcasting has the ability to allow you to tell the story a little differently and allow you to have a chance to play around with the medium and maybe be a little more experimental, be a little more bold, because in that sense, it allows you to have the courage to do the things that you want to do the way that you really want to do it.
Well, in podcasting, you're always surprised. And because it's such a new and growing medium, it has the ability to always give you like a little kick when you get like the numbers back for a show. When May and I worked on She Says She's Fine, we did a couple of episodes on sex, on contraceptives, on PCOS, and on menstrual health and hygiene, which all did really, really well. But the episode that is the most popular episode in that series was around miscarriages. And that shocked me. Because not only was it the first episode we ever recorded for the podcast, we may have not released it first, but it was an episode that was genuinely heartfelt. And it helped us understand that in podcasting, sometimes the conversations that are unsaid in public spaces is the conversation people want to listen to. It's the thing that helped us like develop the idea of the podcast and it gave validation to us in the things that we wanted to achieve through that show. Retention numbers are the things we actually pay attention to. Success is not always determined by the number of downloads. It's how long people listen to a podcast. And I genuinely find that if you make a good show with a good topic, especially podcasts in the social sector, you tend to have really, really high retention numbers because people aren't coming here for a lark. They're coming here to be informed. So the way you design these shows is supposed to be about the information that you wish to communicate to your listener. That should always be a focus. You don't have to be an entertainer when you're making a podcast in the social sector. You have to just have facts and present those facts in an easy, listenable fashion. That's how I look at those podcasts. We tend to find that at least 65% of our audience, we tend to notice that our audience spends at least 65% of them reach the end of the podcast, which is a really high retention rate. These podcasts run between 25 to 45 minutes. That means your listener is investing at least half an hour to your show. That's far more than what people usually spend on YouTube, Instagram, or just scrolling through Facebook. So you do have an engaged audience, and you need to know that your conversation will be heard and heard fully, provided you record it well. The other thing that I like to talk about, or an insight that I have on podcasting, is promotions and how do you plan your podcast. Most people, once they press that publish, they record it, because podcasts are labors of love. Like, a lot of time and energy goes into recording the content, coordinating with guests, making sure you've done your research well, editing it at the end, and then you press publish and you're almost relieved. Very, very few people make a promotional plan for their show and their episodes. You need to do both. Because once you've gone through the process of making a podcast, it is still up to you to making sure a large group of people listen to your show. So the time I believe in using the metrics of social media is when you actually are using it to promote your podcast. Don't judge your podcast by social media metrics, but do promote your show on social media. Share it with a friend. Ask your colleagues to listen to it. Because in podcasting, even today, one of the main ways that people find new shows is through recommendations. There's no algorithm pushing your podcast. There's actual people who push your podcast. So those are my two insights on the world of podcasting.
If you had to come on your own show as a guest on your podcast, what question would you ask to the audience or discuss with them on MHM?
So, with regards to menstrual health and hygiene, I do think that there isn't enough being talked about. There are not enough conversations around menstrual health. And the great thing about podcasting is that it allows you to actually have those conversations. And the one thing that I would say is that don't be afraid to talk about or say things that you wouldn't normally say anywhere else. Podcasting is also an incredibly intimate medium. You're literally in people's ears. So when you're talking to someone about what you're going through, they feel like you're talking directly to them. So in some sense, you feel like you're not alone, like you have someone who really understands you. So when you put your story out there, or you talk about things that maybe you think aren't necessarily everyone's experience, it might be a lot of people's experience. So I think take advantage of the intimacy of the medium and be able to put those conversations, put those stories out there and be unafraid. Because I think with podcasting, it really kind of helps you make those connections so much better because it really is a personal, intimate medium. And then you also realize that you're not alone in your experience, that there are actually other people out there just like you going through those things, and that you can actually find the help or laugh or talk about the things that you want to in a fun way, in a silly way, in a serious way. So whatever way in which you want to do this, I think podcasting becomes that sort of, that way in which that tool in which you're able to communicate and actually get to people.
I would like to thank May and Sean today for joining us at the MHM Summit. I look forward to further collaborations with you and all the best for the wonderful work that you are doing. Don't forget to share, like, and see their work and join their podcast and hear the wonderful work and the stories they have to share. Thank you.
Hey, I'd just like to say thank you so much to Toto Afrika. It was an honor for me, May, and my partner, Sean. We're from a podcast production company and consultancy called Made in India. And we were really excited to be part of this event and to share some of our insights around podcasting. And I really hope that maybe one day we can be part of your podcast journey.